Many on the US left are backing President Obama's re-election only because they feel the Republican agenda would be even worse for the country. Should voters cast their ballot for those whose principles they share, or simply for the lesser of two evils? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Progressive forces in the US have spoken out about rising inequality, the expansion of covert international warfare, and expanded curbs on civil liberties under President Obama. His economic policies are accused of institutionalizing the gap between rich and poor, as he failed to take comprehensive action for those facing foreclosure in favor of protecting the interests of Wall Street. From economic policy to climate change to foreign policy, President Obama has deeply disappointed his progressive base. But the prospect of a Republican victory next week is enough for many to stick with the president. His policies may be short on specifics, but the ideological framework put forward by Mitt Romney has the left frightened. They fear even deeper cuts to social spending for the poor in favor of more perks for the rich, even more neglect of a changing climate, a greater assault on the rights of the working majority and of women. So that's prompted many progressive voices to reluctantly root for Obama. Vote for third-party progressive candidates where Obama is safe, they argue, but where the contest is close, vote Democrat. Some still bitterly blame those who voted for Ralph Nader instead of Al Gore in 2000 for the George W. Bush years and the ensuing warfare and economic policy that favored the 1%. Earlier, I spoke to Ralph Nader. I asked him to explain exactly why progressives have been disappointed with Obama, whether it was a case of liberals projecting their ideals onto him, or whether Obama simply broke his promises.
Well, I think Barack Obama invited public misjudgment of Barack Obama. He's very conflict averse. He has strong conservative streaks in him when it comes to challenging corporate power. And he has this propensity of turning his back on people who support him because he takes their votes for granted and continually becomes concessionary to people who might oppose him, especially corporate power.
But what do you think the legacy of his first term is then?
One of considerable indecision. He had to make certain decisions such as the bailout of Wall Street, a modified and incomplete health insurance scheme, expanding the war in Afghanistan. But by and large, his promises were not kept, especially for worker rights and living wage, and cracking down on corporate crime against consumers, the environment, and taxpayers.
What about the suggestion that in a second term then he can finally live up to any progressive hopes that were placed within him?
Well, this is part of the liberals' hope springs eternal mantra. They hope that Clinton in the second term would be different. It never works out that way. The way a president behaves in the first term is rarely exceeded in terms of the public interest by the second term.
Nonetheless, I mean, we've interviewed so many people over the last few years who are critical of President Obama on economic policy, environmental policy, expanding the wars, civil liberties. And yet they still, at the end of the interview, say, well, I'm still going to vote for him. He's still the lesser of two evils. What do you make of that argument?
When that argument is presented, the voters who have that argument lose their bargaining power. They lose their pulling power because they're saying to Obama, take me, I'm yours, because Romney is worse. At the same time, the corporate interests are pulling 24/7 Obama in their direction.
Right, but so you wouldn't argue then for people to make a protest vote in states where they know Democrats are likely to get in. You're saying people should vote with their heart, basically wherever, even in swing states then?
I don't believe in tactical voting, although people are free to do that. I believe in voting your conscience, voting for who and what you believe in.
Well, let's look at the third parties then. Once again, it seems they've barely made a dent. Is there ever any hope then for third parties? I mean, that's why people think it's a wasted vote.
We operate in this country in a two-party dictatorship that has all kinds of ways of excluding third-party candidates from getting on the ballot, from getting on the debates, from having enough money to compete, from getting access to the media. And so the only way I see our politics going into multi-party systems, the way they do in Western Europe and Japan and elsewhere, is for a multi-billionaire like another Ross Perot or a Mayor Bloomberg getting into the race.
But over the last year, we have seen uprisings of sort in Wisconsin for labor rights, for example, or the Occupy movement. Still, though, these issues aren't on the electoral agenda this year. How can that be?
That's because the Democratic Party, led by President Obama, did not go and support the resistance in Wisconsin, although he was invited and Vice President Biden were invited by the state labor federation in Wisconsin. And they didn't really support the Occupy Wall Street efforts, highlighting the gross inequality of wealth and power in this country, even though at their peak, the Occupy people had a majority of the polls behind them. This would not happen with the Republicans. If there is a major resistance in a state led by the Tea Party, you can be sure that the Republican leadership would go out full flood in support of them.
But in some ways, the Occupy movement came out of a sense of disillusionment with any attempts of either influencing the Democrats from within or from the possibility of success of a third party. But having seen it fizzle out in this way, or has it fizzled out, or do you think they're quietly plotting some alternative which will suddenly flower at some point in the coming years?
Well, the Occupy movement, which captured the imagination of the public in the fall of 2011, didn't have a plan B when they were evicted from 110 encampments all over the country by the police. Plan B should have been a living wage. It should have been elevating the minimum wage in this country, inflation adjusted, to what it was in 1988. 30 million workers would have gotten a raise under that change. But the Occupy movement avoided politics. They didn't like politicians. They didn't want to focus on Congress. And yet, if they want to reduce inequality, they have to focus on Congress.
But we're told still, in various salons around the country, people ask, and the various committees that are still working on economic issues, specific economic issues and so forth. Do you have much hope in those, though?
Well, Occupy now is devolved into just local support against foreclosed homes, for example, or they'll picket a certain large bank. But as a national movement, they've got to develop a different kind of strategy if they're going to survive.
Well, what strategy then? I mean, you've said that you've discussed or touched upon the barriers for third-party candidates. Occupy clearly trying a different route seems to have at least temporarily fizzled out. So what is the solution?
The strategy is to surround every office of every senator and representative back home with mass rallies focusing on a living wage. That's the issue that everybody understands. That's the issue that will reverse the declining wages and standard living of the American people. That's the issue that contrasts the plight of the working man and woman in America with the massive billionaires and multimillionaires who are raking off the productivity gains and the earnings of these workers.
So, is it time for the progressive left to vote with their conscience and ditch President Obama? Joining me from Burbank, California is Matt Stoller. He's a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. He recently wrote an article titled "The Progressive Case Against Obama" for Salon.com. Here in the studio, Harold Meyerson. He's a Washington Post columnist and editor-at-large at the progressive magazine American Prospect. And Harold Meyerson, as a progressive, how much of a dilemma did you have in this election?
Not much, because what the Republican Party has come to represent and what Mitt Romney personifies is really the shredding of what remains of a social contract in the United States. It's a very serious threat. It threatens people's retirement security, their access to medicine, their right to join a union, all of which the Republican Party seems eager and is materially interested in getting rid of.
Right, and all of which, though the argument goes, President Obama is moving closer and closer to as he tries to forge bipartisan consensus. You can't be a comparative progressive. You either believe in some ideals or don't, and President Obama doesn't seem to believe in those progressive
But elections
ideals.
are all about being comparative. It's not I'm not sitting here grading the individual candidates. It's not like we each hand them a report card when we go to vote. We either vote for them or against them. And the threat that the Republican Party, which has been radicalized by the Tea Party, and the Romney candidacy pose are just monumental to a nation that is already in bad times. And I would argue that while I differ with the president on a number of issues, what he did do in getting health care for 30 million people, and the regulations on the banks, although I'd like them to be much stronger, and the bailout of the auto industry are all actions which commend him to progressives.
All right, Matt Stoller, do you find that argument convincing?
Well, I think it's better to look at the track record of what Obama has actually done over the last 4 years rather than the sort of PR that people talk about, mostly progressives. In 2010, 93 cents out of every dollar of increased income from the Obama recovery went to the top 1%. Under Bush, that was 65 cents of every dollar. So inequality is much worse under Obama than it was under Bush. And this is a result of Obama's policy framework. He came into office in 2009. He presided over a foreclosure crisis, which he did not address, and he reinflated financial assets for the wealthy. And this was an intentional strategy to bifurcate the country. And I think that progressives need to look at him and say, well, this is what he actually did. And when you look at him, it's not obvious to me that there are very many differences with Mitt Romney, and it's not obvious to me that Mitt Romney would be a substantially worse president than Barack Obama. And I think that it's foolish of progressives to not understand the real risks of a second term, including cutting of possibly Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of which Barack Obama offered in his first term and is currently talking about his eagerness to get to in the transition period between the first and the second term.
Right. I mean, Harold Meissen, that's the other argument, though, is that President Obama is particularly dangerous because he's able to institutionalize policies that the Republicans have only dreamt about for years. I mean, you talk about healthcare reform. Yes, he got it done, but of course we all know it was hatched up in a right-wing think tank and was Republican orthodoxy for a long time. Similarly, with looming discussions about Social Security, there is that fear that he can go where Mitt Romney probably couldn't go because there would be an outcry in the streets.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case. With the Obama administration, with the Democratic Party generally, all of this is contested terrain. With Romney and the Republicans, it's a fait accompli. And I think if Obama does try to cut a deal on Social Security, and he may well, there will be pushback no matter what from the Democratic base. Just as, I mean, the AFL-CIO is going to hold a press conference a day after the election in which they are going to announce this is going to be a major issue for them. They're keeping their field organizers in the field. They're not bringing them back after the election to fight against this. And more broadly, as a sort of broader historical rejoinder to Matt, I would say that the drift towards inequality and all this has a lot to do with the strength of different social movements in the United States. And our last three Democratic presidents, Obama, Clinton, Carter, were presidents who presided at a time when there wasn't really a mass left pushing them to the left, as it was during Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt's presidencies.
Okay, but then we have to look at why, where is that movement? And actually, the organization wearechange.org did a very interesting experiment. And we're talking about, we're already moving on to future policy with Social Security, but let's face it, President Obama has passed a lot of policies that are pretty contentious to many on the left. So what wearechange.org did was they presented prospective Obama voters with some of the achievements of President Obama's first term. However, they presented them as the Romney policy platform for his first term if he's elected. And these are the results of that experiment.
I'm going to name off a couple policies that Romney's proposing if he becomes president he's going to implement. I want to know what you think about him as an Obama supporter. Romney said he would not only extend the Patriot Act, but expand it, and also surveil and spy on American citizens more without a warrant. Romney has actually called for this. How do you feel about that?
I don't feel good about it at all, period. Nah. He's going too far with this. Nah.
But I just don't believe the government should be able to invade your privacy like that.
Romney actually said he would support a law called the NDAA, which would grant him the power to indefinitely detain any American citizen and arrest any American citizen at any time he wants under his discretion to fight the war on terror without a court of law. How do you feel about that?
again, unconstitutional and immoral.
I don't feel good about that.
That's a violation of our absolute rights. It's not possible to do that.
No.
I think he's a psychopath.
Romney is actually proposing to actually establish a secret kill list that also would include American citizens, which he would personally call off on and decide if they would get drone bombed or not. How do you feel about that policy Romney is proposing?
Well, I mean, it sounds unconstitutional to me, and immoral, and he talks about morality all the time.
He's watching too much Terminator, actually.
Romney also proposed using drone bombs in countries that we haven't declared war in, and actually said he would expand them 6 times more than George W. Bush.
Of course he did.
That's incredible. That's just incredible.
I actually have a confession to make. I feel really bad. I lied. I'm actually not supporting Romney in any way, shape, or form. He probably would do those things, but what I mentioned, Obama has actually done within the last 4 years. He has passed the NDAA. He does have a secret kill list. He has expanded the Patriot Act. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean...
You can look it up yourself. I'm not lying.
For real?
Truth this time, yeah.
Oh, man.
Well, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but there's a lot of other reasons why I'm going to vote for Obama, and hearing that stuff honestly doesn't change it.
So that's simply on some of those policies that have been passed before we even get on to grand bargains about Social Security and what the Republicans have been trying to achieve for years but haven't been able to. I mean, just to pick up some of those particular issues, if indefinite detention and kill list and all these other policies aren't enough to finally say, hang on, enough is enough. President Obama, as a progressive, I can't. No matter how bad the Republicans are, I can't vote for him. And what is the limit then?
Well, that is a very good question, since, as I said, elections are comparative. Look, there's no question that in many ways the Democratic Party has moved rightward as the labor movement has weakened. I think you can find a pretty steady correlation to that. By the same token, Obama really was not, this is one area where Ralph Nader was wrong, he was not bound to push for major health care reform, particularly after they lost Ted Kennedy's seat in the special election. He has elected to do things, saving the auto industry, and these are issues that relate to the lives of tens of millions of Americans, and there's a clear difference with Mitt Romney. For all the failings of Barack Obama, you cannot dismiss the fact that the Republican Party has been radicalized, and that would be the dominant tendency were Mitt Romney elected president.
So Matt Stoller, once again, look, it's terrible, but it could be so much worse.
Well, I mean, I really like that video, but you know, the essential problem with the Obama supporters is that they argue that the president is essential with things like the auto bailout, which he gets credit for, and I credit him with, while at the same time saying, well, things like inequality, you know, that's a result of a lack of social movements. So the presidency is at once essential and utterly powerless. It's essentially a dishonest pose. And as you saw with the people in that video, what they really want is they want their president on TV. And it's not about the policy choices that he's making. It's not about inequality. It's not about war and peace. It's not about broken promises. It's really about a consumer mindset. And I think that you have to look at, you know, what Harold just said about, well, there will be this Democratic uprising if there is a deal on the table for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, even as he's saying that he will vote for Barack Obama, as essentially pointing to the basic inconsistency of what these supporters believe. They're just not consistent. They're not intellectually consistent. They're not morally consistent. And they leave out the role of the public in fighting back and constraining our political leaders, who we, you know, should not distrust, especially someone like Obama because of his track record.
Yeah, I mean, is part of this, though, then, it's about trust, though. President Obama is fundamentally a progressive. It seems to be the suggestion. So therefore, in the end, you know, he might have had to do some of these things.
But he's not. I mean, there's simply no evidence of that. There's no evidence that he cares about inequality. There's no evidence he cares about civil rights. There's a lot of evidence that he has pursued a highly malevolent policy to take away rights from workers, from debtors, and from whistleblowers. He has tortured Bradley Manning. There is a lot of things that he has done that indicate, what his policy preferences are. And he called Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon of Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan smart, savvy businessmen, because that's what he believes. That's what this guy is.
Matt, I think we're going to.
So what you'll notice is that people won't hold him to the same standards that they held George Bush.
We only have 20 seconds left on your satellite window. What about the Supreme Court, at least, though? The ramifications.
Well, I think that there's a fair argument to be made that Obama will pursue better policies in certain areas. But as I said, I think that the risk that Obama will be a more effective evil, that he will be able to gut social safety programs, that he will be able to destroy entitlements, is also worth weighing. And I think that risk is very real. And the risk that he puts the left to sleep again is also something that we should keep in mind.
All right, I believe we're about to lose your satellite window, so we'll leave it there with you, Matt, and Harold and I will continue the discussion. Yep, we just lost the satellite window there. So let's continue. That was Matt Stoller, of course. Does none of that at all concern you then? I mean, that seems like quite a convincing case then, that this can't go on. And the longer this goes on, the longer that the progressives allow President Obama the leeway, unquestioningly, when it comes to the election time, the less likely you're going to get a responsive polity, a responsive
I utterly
political
disagree, because Matt may question the morality of this, but I question Matt's knowledge of American history. If you follow what Matt is arguing, you have to believe that Lyndon Johnson personally was the most radical president we've had in the last 80 years. That's nonsense. He was pushed by social movements. American politics changes because of social movements, not because of political parties on the left or protest votes. That's never been the case, not since the Whig Party broke up in the 1850s and the Republicans emerged. That is not, it is simply an ahistoric view of how America works when it is pushing towards social change. Presidents get pushed. They do not go out there.
How much social change we've seen, how much polarization we've seen over the last 5, 10 years, frankly. Just look at the economic statistics on the polarization about who's getting the money, who's reaping the rewards of the recovery.
Absolutely. That is because...
Isn't that an enormous social change we're witnessing right now without much of
No. Well, that's because the balance of social forces is tilted toward capital rather than labor in this country. That's because there's no more collective bargaining in the private sector. It's down to 7% unionization in the private sector, and the 7% that's unionized, because 93% of the people around them are not unionized, don't have much bargaining power.
Well, but do you not see it's valuable to at least have the options for change in third parties? I mean, for example, we've covered a lot of the third party debates. Here's one of the third party candidates, Justice Party, Rocky Anderson, setting out his stall.
We know the Republican and Democrats have some differences, but both of them have morphed into a militarist, corporatist, anti-democratic force that has betrayed basic human and civil rights. We know that both of these major candidates have been bought and paid for. That's why neither of them stands for health care for all as in the rest of the industrialized world. It's why neither of them ever talk about breaking the stranglehold the military-industrial complex has on our government. And that's why neither of them talk about providing the essential leadership on the climate crisis, the greatest tragedy facing Earth's inhabitants. Obama and Romney have refused to discuss the corrupting influence of money flowing from Wall Street banks, from the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical industry, the fossil fuel industry, or military contractors, because they are the recipients of that corrupting money.
Something I've always found quite striking is the contempt that some progressives have for third-party candidates, even as they agree with everything they say and agree that they need the changes needed.
That contempt greatly expanded after Ralph Nader tipped Florida to George W. Bush in cahoots with...
Was it Ralph Nader, or was it a terrible campaign by Al Gore who didn't win his own state?
I'm sorry, but this is a major historic phenomenon with lots of causes, but you can't deny that that was a cause. And that's when I think the contempt came up. And, when you talked about the rising inequality, that has something to do with the Bush tax cuts, which should not have been the Gore tax cuts. Had Ralph Nader, not been so recklessly self-indulgent as to decide to campaign, not just for president, but specifically in Florida, when he knew it was a swing state.
Progressives have to simply hold their nose and vote for a man who, many of whose policies, particularly on drone strikes and kill lists, they find morally reprehensible.
democracy's great gift to the people, and that's basically how it plays out. Basically.
Well, if you want to change America to a parliamentary multi-party system, I'd be there in a minute on a party of the left, but we don't have that as an option. I'm willing to work for that. I have advocated that.
You allow change to perhaps begin, though.
It doesn't allow change to begin. The only time the third party has affected an election is Ralph Nader helping George W. Bush. Get real.
All right, we'll leave it there. Harold Meyerson, thank you very much. My thanks to Matt Soller as well. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C.